Thank you for joining us in Season 2 of the REALigionPodcast, where a rabbi and a reverend walk into a podcast and talk real about religion.
Joel, good afternoon.
Howdy, Rabbi Eric. How are you down there in the Georgia world?
I am wonderful. Today is the first day of sabbatical.
Nuh-uh. I did not catch that up. Oh my gosh. So what have you written today?
Day one, I wrote 1,600 words.
You lie.
No, 1,600. I didn't say they were good or coherent, but they are 1,600 words. And I didn't do the thing that I joked with a friend of just saying all work and no play makes Eric a dull boy and then copying and pasting that. I did not do that.
Good. That wouldn't count. No Harry Potter write in your own blood moments.
No, there's full sentences, subject, noun, agreement, hopefully thoughts progressing to more thoughts. We'll see. I actually have a wonderful congregant and friend volunteered to read and make suggestions and edit. And this is a person who is an accomplished writer and thoughtful and smart and all those wonderful things. And it'll keep me to task, which is also good.
Nice. If you're like me, the early writings suck, but through the editing process, they become something that is semi-understandable.
Absolutely. But I do have a funny story that is relevant to our podcast. I had a Joel moment today.
Uh-oh.
I almost channeled you, and then I didn't. Instead, I walked out. So I was sitting at a local coffee shop that we have been to many times, and I was the only person in it, sat down, had my computer, my coffee, a nice sugary snack, and was writing. And these two gentlemen come in. And it was funny because they sat right next to me at the table next to me. Not that this is a huge place, but so I'm already a little bit annoyed, right? Like, it's like, couldn't they pick another table? And they start talking about the church, Jesus this, Jesus that, which, is fine. And I happen to know that, there's lots of different Christian study groups that meet at coffee shops. Like, that's great. But then they started talking about how they can't believe that there are Christian clergy that accept the sin of homosexuality.
Aha.
And it was at that moment that I had the slight thought of engaging them as I'm writing, Jewish theology and things like that. And then I thought that, nope, my time will be better served by working out and then coming back after they've left, which is exactly what I did.
Nicely done, Mr. Sabbatical. That is the way to sabbat out of your dilemma there. May I guess that these were two males who were having this conversation?
Two males, yes. I also was, rephrasing, what would Jesus do? What would Joel do? Would Joel engage them? Certainly you'd roll your eyes and be annoyed or disgusted. But, I was wondering if you would actively participate.
Oh, baby.
In
yeah,
such
sure. Because that's not a street corner, so I'm not banned from doing that by my family anymore. But I would have said, here's one of those clergy who does. What would you like to ask me? Shall we discuss it in detail? And I think we have an episode not too far off in our future this summer where we get into that very topic.
Can we get you in a time machine? And because I would pay a lot of money just to watch that conversation because you handle those things so well. And I just love watching you do that.
Oh, I hate them, Eric. They suck. And the amount of, spiritual discipline it takes to handle them with any grace at all is more than I have. So usually about 20 minutes in, I am on empty. And when I go home, I need 6 hours just to become myself again.
Yeah. And for me, the reason I won't engage in things like that is because there are times that are thankfully rare in number, but times when I get into those sorts of conversations with congregants. And these are people who I will see again, who I do have a relationship with. And so those are the ones that I find incredibly difficult, because it's not like some stranger off the street that means nothing to me. I mean, you know what I mean. I don't mean to be disparaging, or to seem disparaging. But those conversations with beloved congregants, I find so difficult and enervating and all those sorts of things.
Yes. I think we get to that topic in August. So
yes. And, I mean, I think today's is, tangentially related, although it's important to make the distinction between gender and sexuality, of course. But we're going to talk about gender identity and how our traditions, in terms of texts, namely the Torah, Bible, New Testament, parse out gender. And women are definitely not equal in the Torah. And I'm going to take a wild guess, Joel, that's true in the New Testament as well.
Very much so. But hopefully in this conversation, I can take some violent texts that are very problematic when used improperly, and I can give some people that have been hurt by them another way to hear them, so that they can resist those who would do violence with those texts and hear some of the progress and grace that was meant in those texts from their original context. But let's figure out, where do we start?
Well, I'll start with names. It's always been something I've been fascinated with, namely how children get their names in the Hebrew Bible. So you know, Abraham, Joseph, all the names we have in the Hebrew Bible and what they mean. And it's always fascinated me that women, the mom, more often than not, by a huge percentage, does the naming of their baby. And that is important, because that is an act of power. I mean, if we go back to the story of creation, God parades all of the animals in front of Adam at the time to look for a partner. And Adam names them, thus conferring some kind of responsibility or ownership, perhaps. But on the flip side of that, lots of times those names have to do with their relationship with their husband. And so the child, I don't want to say is defined, but is named by what the wife wants or expects out of the husband. So a perfect example of this, if not the prime example of this, is Jacob's first wife, Leah. Listeners may know that Jacob wanted to marry Rachel. He's forced to marry Leah. And Leah loves him and wants him to love her as much, if not more so, than her beautiful sister. And so when Leah has children, she names them as a wish fulfillment of what she wants for her husband. So this would fail for those who are movie fans, you may know of the Bechdel test. Bechdel, am I pronouncing that correctly?
Not a clue.
So it's a test, so to speak, of and I may be completely butchering this, but of whether a movie has appropriate feminist themes and personhood in terms of authority and in terms of freedom. And so, like, one of the things is a woman defined by her relationship to a man? Is she in need of protection, like the princess, so to speak? And so I think I'll put it in the show notes with a link. It's super interesting. And more movies are getting better at it, but it's a classic trope that, of course, they're not. Anyway, Leah names her sons to get Jacob's love. And yet, and the other piece, which is important, is that Jewish identity is conferred by the mother. So according to the laws of Judaism, one is Jewish if they're born to a Jewish mother, or, of course, if they convert. Doesn't matter, according to halakha, Jewish law, if the father is Jewish. The mother has to be Jewish. The father could be whatever he is. But those are the exception, not the rule, in terms of women having authority, women having being stakeholders in leadership. When the Talmud was written, all of the elders were men. When the first verse of Pirkei Avot tells us that Moses received the Torah from God and Moses handed it to Joshua and Joshua to the elders and the elders to the men of the great assembly, all of those were men. Women's voices are, if not minimized, if not silenced, then certainly minimized. And so what we do as modern Jews, and I'll stop rambling in a second, Joel, is we create midrashim, a word you've all heard me use before, stories that lift up these women's voices. So an example of that is, where was Sarah when God commanded Abraham to sacrifice Isaac? Like, you think that is an important part of the story of what the mom and the wife thinks about all this. And so this is all to say that it is complicated and difficult. But for me as a Reformed Jew, it's incumbent upon me to take those texts, and we're going to get into some specifics that are difficult, and adapt them to where our morality is today.
What did they decide? Where was Sarah at the almost sacrifice of Isaac?
Oh, well, there's a ton of different midrashim and stories. There's not one singular thing. But I can link to something like that. I'll type that out now so I remember to.
Was she yanking on Abraham's neck? Was she
like, what the hell are you doing?
Yeah, sharpening the knife. Yikes.
For those of us that believe that the Torah, the Bible, was written by people, it was most likely men. And so the worldview, the theology, all of it represents a male-centered hierarchy, just like society did. Mm-hmm. But that's not where we are, thankfully, in the year 2021. Or at least that's not where some of us are. Those two men in the coffee shop that I encountered, sadly, are probably right in there.
Well, probably one of the oddest places for me in the text to even look at are the two creation stories, the Genesis 1 versus the Genesis 2:3. In one of them, God creates them male and female in the image of God, and there's no difference between them. They are both created at the same time. They are both created with the spark of godness in them. They are both called very good by God. So humanity, in its spectrum of sexuality, is something that represents God's own self and is the only thing that God calls very good out of all the created things that God calls good. Genesis 2 and 3 then have a different way of saying it, where the Adam is created earlier, and then all the other creatures, and then finally, from the rib of the man, the woman. And there's different language about her as a result of her being from Adam's rib. What I tend to notice is those who love to lift up strong gender differences, natural gender differences, they would use the word natural, God created differences between genders, meaning not just in anatomy or biology or chemistry or hormones, but meaning in worthiness as well. They love to refer to Genesis 2, very seldom refer to Genesis 1. And it's troublesome for me to have people talk about Adam and Eve. Well, there is no Adam and Eve in Genesis 1. That's not how they're talked about. It's only Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve, in Genesis 2 and 3. And if you want to make that argument, Genesis 2 can help you kind of if you twist it. But if you hold it as another way of reading what Genesis 1 says, the desire for people to use Scripture to create power differences between gender falls apart. But I find too many religious communities, they don't bother to read the equality across the gender spectrum as much as they love to read the power dynamic and differences across the gender spectrum that Genesis 2 lends itself to.
Yeah, that's a really good reading of the two creation stories. There's a book, again, put it in the show notes. I don't know that it relates to those gender differences, but it's called The Lonely Man of Faith by Rabbi Soloveitchik. It is, I would say, and I haven't read it in a long time, but it's one of those books that anyone interested in religion should read. It's certainly written with a Jewish perspective, but what he does is he takes those two creation stories and compares them with one another. And it's all, and in very interesting ways, but I don't think gender identity is one of them. So Joel, thanks for that chiddush, as we say, that new interpretation.
Well, you mentioned the women naming the child. It's Luke 1, the very first chapter of the Gospel according to Luke, kind of foretells the birth of John the Baptist. And the mother, Elizabeth, and the father is Zechariah. Zechariah is one of the high priests. And he's in the temple one day when he's zapped with the revelation that his wife is pregnant. And because of that, he becomes mute. He is not able to speak. And from whatever stage she is in her pregnancy all the way to where the child is delivered. And the child shows up on the 8th day for circumcision, and the crowd assumes his name will be Zechariah. And the mother, Elizabeth, says, no, his name is John. And the crowd and the presiding priests go, Zechariah, and they look at him, and he comes over and he grabs a tablet and he writes, his name is John, and he gets his voice back. So there's something about that same give the voice to the female that the very beginning of the Gospel of Luke reminds. And if a man assumes that his voice is more powerful or more worthy than the woman's voice, he loses it. And when the crowd doesn't believe the woman's voice, but defers to the man, he is still mute until he confirms her voice. So I notice that connection to the gender naming difference that you were lifting up earlier.
And Judaism, especially traditional Judaism, has this interesting dynamic with regard to women and men that I'll lift up through maybe going off script here, that it's not a text from the Torah, but rather our liturgy. So in the daily morning liturgy, morning, M-O-R, not M-O-U-R, there's the Shacharit service, which is the morning service. And there's a list of blessings. Sometimes we call them the blessings for daily life. This is a bit of an aside, but there's probably 10 or 15 of them. If I thought about it long enough, I'd have the exact number. And you say them, you don't say them in shul, in synagogue, or original. You say them by yourself. And so the first one is the minute you wake up, you open your eyes, and literally the words you say are thank you for being able to see. And so there are all of these things that simply by being alive, we have these blessings. And so they kind of inculcate us with an attitude of gratitude, so to speak. And everyone says the same ones, except for one, where men say, well, I'll start with the women first. Women say, thank you, God, for creating me according to your plan. And
oh
men
boy, there's
say,
the God's plan again. Dang it.
Oh, well, yeah. Well, what I'm about to say is even worse than that, Joel. And then men say, thank you, God, for not creating me a woman.
Oh.
And this is said now. So since those prayers were created, now they are said in shul and synagogue, and they're said by lots of people who consider themselves, forward thinking, not necessarily egalitarian, but certainly, they don't see themselves as oppressive, right? And the backstory of that text, and by the way, I am not apologizing for it. I'm not defending it at all. But the backstory of that text has to do with, you were talking about the differences in gender. And here's where, traditional Judaism, like other societies, do confuse gender and sexuality, that women get to give birth. Right. And giving birth, the act of pregnancy and forming life, it is equal to all of the rest of the mitzvot we have. So we have 613 laws. So when I teach this to kids, I say, imagine a scale, and, we have 612 of them. And then there's giving birth. And that one, it's almost like it equals out. And so what women are told sometimes when they want to do things like chant Torah or wrap tefillin, which is the leather phylacteries, sometimes people see, or lead prayer or study Talmud. It's like this condescending, well, you don't need to do that because you're a woman. You're more spiritual than us. The number of times I've heard women are more spiritual than men as what I perceive to be an excuse for not letting women do things that they want to do. And so the reason for saying, thank you, God, for not creating me a woman, is because as a man, you get to do more mitzvot, more laws, more rituals than a woman does. And that's what you're thanking God for. Now, this might beg the question, well, rabbi, Jewish person living in the 21st century that considers himself, a liberal Jew, how do you deal with it? Very easily. It's not in our prayer book. It's absolutely not in our prayer book. And this is one of the things about Reform Judaism that I love. It's also difficult, is that there are times where we abrogate Jewish tradition or law based on our moral principles. And this is a case of that.
Gosh, there's a text where it describes childbirth as punishment. The pain of childbirth shall be...
Also Genesis,
yes,
early chapters.
Yeah, the chapter 2, creation 2 and 3, creation story, not the chapter 1. So there it is again. It's not a blessing of childbirth, which you could read if there was only Genesis 1. But if you're going to read Genesis 2 and 3, then, childbirth is a curse on you because you're the one that tempted him. And my feel is that those kind of prayerful sentences, thank you for not making me a woman. Otherwise, I would have been the one that betrayed the man, and I would have to go through the pain of childbirth. That kind of perspective is not remembering the whole of the Genesis creation story.
And there's also, of course, an irony in that the men are the ones making the rules that the women can or cannot follow. So it's kind of an interesting catch-22. Well,
it's gaslighting is what it is, right?
Yeah, it's gaslighting. It's a troubling catch-22. Yeah, it is gaslighting. That's a good point. One of the reasons, if anyone follows Israeli politics or Jewish politics, and the two here are blended, is that in traditional Judaism, for a couple to get divorced, the husband has to agree to it. It's not like in America where, if you want out, you can get out, right? I mean, it might be painful. It probably will be painful. I mean, how could it not be? But in traditional Judaism, the man has to give the woman what's called a get. That's the Hebrew document of divorce. So here's the thing. If a woman can't get the get, pun intended, unfortunately, yes, but considers herself divorced, doesn't speak to this guy, it's not like she committed adultery, but, maybe even lives in another country. If she gets... Let's say she moves to America and gets legally married in America and has children. Mm-hmm. Those children, according to Jewish law, are considered bastard children. because she never got divorced. And so again, you see how the patriarchy affects not only a woman's sense of identity, but now her children's.
Boy.
I mean, that's a whole subject. I mean, but
Jesus has a lot to say about divorce, but usually it's not about the women. He will say something like, you have heard it said that if, in order to get a divorce, the man simply has to give a certificate. But I say to you, you shall not divorce her. You shall not sever from her or let her go, except on the grounds of infidelity. And even that language, you can hear it in there. There is a progressive aspect from where it was to where Jesus is talking to it. But in today's language, it really sounds like the woman is property of the man. Yeah. And it's all on the man, and it really doesn't matter what she wants. But in Jesus' time and perspective, he was saying, you can't upgrade to a younger model. You can't decide that you are no longer responsible for her just because she disagreed with you on something. You're committed to each other, and you are responsible for her all the way. And he was, if you hear it in that context like you were just describing, they're not disposable. But it's not far enough to reach where we are today. And there's another example of this in John chapter 8, where the Pharisees and scribes bring Jesus a woman who has been caught in adultery. There it is again. Adultery means that she was either still married to another man or unmarried, and she was caught with someone. And they stand her before the crowd, and they really are threatening to stone her. And they use the law. The law of Moses commands us to stone women who do this. What do you say? And this was all to trap Jesus, being inconsistent to the law. And I love it. He bends down and he writes something in the sand with his finger, it says. And then he says, anybody here who is without sin is welcome to throw the first stone. And they hear that, and they all walk away. And he says to her, well, woman, where'd they go? Where are all the people that were going to judge you? And she says, there's no one left, sir. And he says, neither do I judge you. Go your way. And there's something about the re-empowerment, right? The way the law is and the way the law was being interpreted, she was just disposable. My question is, where is the dude who was caught in adultery too? Why didn't they drag him along? Surely the law says something about him too. But they just, in that culture, that's not the way it worked. And
there's the issue of levirate marriage, which is if a wife's husband dies, she's obligated to marry the brother, whether she wants to or not. And so there's all these things where the power dynamic is so egregious.
Or the brother is obligated to receive her as yeah. So yes. And it's binding in both directions, but it's clearly a transfer of property, right? She is willed to the brother.
So the marriage. So we talked about the certificate of divorce. Let's go the other way. The certificate of marriage, it's called the ketubah, which comes from the word, the root letters that means writing. And, any Jewish couple, most Jewish couples have a ketubah hanging in their bedroom or somewhere in their house. And the traditional language is very much the groom acquiring the bride. This is where we get the concept of a dowry from. Mm-hmm. And in Jewish weddings today, if anyone's been to a Jewish wedding, after the bride comes forth, whoever's walking the bride up, the groom, again, traditional Jewish, this isn't a traditional cisgender wedding, heterosexual wedding. You could still have a cisgender gay wedding. I'm still learning these things. Important.
Yes, we're all over the gender and sexuality
that's
space
right.
now.
Yes. So in a traditional wedding, the bride circles the groom 7 times, and 7 is a special number in Judaism. Of course, it's the number of days in creation, and 7 is one of those numbers that pops up all over the Torah and Bible,
and in Vegas.
One of the things. What did you say?
And in Vegas.
And in
lucky sevens in Vegas all the time.
Nice. Or unlucky, depending how you're betting. When I do a wedding, I just did one month or 2 ago. My suggestion to the couple is that it's 3, 3, and 1. Have the groom circle the bride circle the groom, and then you kind of do-si-do around each other one time, and symbolizing the idea that you both are acquiring one another. And so, again, that is a way that Reform liberal Judaism has taken the concept of the ketubah and this ritual of circling and made it applicable to today's norms. Now, we can't always do that. Mm-hmm. So the case in point is the prayer that we just don't say. We're not going to say, make me, thank you, God, for not making me a woman. And so there's various degrees, of course, on how we amend different rituals and different interpretations of texts, depending on what they say and what I guess we want them to say.
I love that. And you may have heard it at other weddings. Who presents this woman to be married, or who gives this woman to be married, is a traditional way in Christian marriage. A question that clergy often ask of the dad who's walking the bride down the aisle. And he may say, I do, or her mother and I, or something like that. I always talk. So far, Jill has presided at several same-sex weddings, and I have exposed myself as happy to do that and glad to do that and willing to do that. I just haven't been invited to do that yet. So I'm sure the day is coming. But Jill's way better at them anyway. So if anybody needs one of those, tap Jill. She's experienced. Well,
if they're Jewish, they could call me.
Yeah, that's right. But for me, I always advise the two, hey, let's change that language. Who blesses the union of these two? Who stands beside these two as they enter this new union? And I may ask it of the bride's family and the groom's family or the other partner's family. And then I'll often ask for a congregational blessing. So it's representing kind of a 3 from one side and a 3 from one side and a 1 from everybody that's gathered here, as a way to remove that dowry transfer of property aspect.
One of the things that I think we do as liberal religionists, if that's an expression, is I think we lift up those areas of religious life where there is a power, a self-reliance, and an autonomy. But again, those are the exception, not the rule. The one, and this is one of the texts that was in our show notes, is this is actually a text that I'm guessing certainly Jewish listeners may not know about. It's not one of the texts that's taught often in religious school. And it's the Daughters of Zelophehad, which is a little bit of a mouthful. And in short, and I'll put a link in the show notes for those that want to read more, but this is in the Torah. Shortly after the revolt of Korach, there was their father died, and the land was unspoken for, the land that was owned. And the daughters wanted the land for themselves. But of course, women can't own land. And they beseeched Moses and the judges, and they got it. But the fact that is an exception, and that the fact that we even have to take note of that shows how rare that was, and in some cases still is, in terms of a religious mindset. I mean, there are still Jews out there. There are still Reform Jews that will say, in a larger synagogue where there's multiple clergy, I want the male rabbi. And that's not okay anymore.
Yes. It happens here as well. Caitlin and I are, we're both pastors of this church, but she and I are very aware that we are constantly trying to embody and symbolize a mutual presence of pastoral authority, leadership, all the above, because in our culture, there is there's plenty of people who do fully receive male or female pastoral leadership equally. There are some who say and want to receive both equally, but they don't yet embody it equally. They still kind of defer to the older male as opposed to the younger female. And then believe it or not, dang it, there are still some who are very clear that there's a difference. There's a story where at my very first church, a couple that was, he was on the pastor nominating committee that called me to that church. And he and his wife took Jill and me and our 3 boys out to lunch after worship, not long after I'd started. And the wife said something like, she found out Jill was still in seminary and also in training to become a pastor. And she said, well, I just don't think women should be a pastor. And Jill asked her, well, have you ever had a pastor that you've really, really loved? And she said, well, no, not really, come to think of it. And then Jill said, well, maybe you should try a woman. Now, there are some texts that Christians use violently regarding men and women in marriage. And one of them is from Ephesians, and maybe, I don't know.
When you say violently, do you mean, and I know you're going to explain it, but do you mean physically violently or just kind of a violation of morality kind of thing?
It has been used to justify male violence against his own wife. The text in Ephesians 5 is, wives, submit to your husbands, or be subject to your husbands, just as you are to the Lord. The husband is the head of the wife, just as Christ is the head of the church. So that text is used in a lot of Christian circles to justify male dominance in the family. His career choices, woman, you have to submit your career to him, and you have to go with him, and you have to follow him. And your job is different than his, and if he needs to go, you defer, you submit, you are subject to him. Now, what people don't often read is the line right before that and right after that. The line after that is, husbands, love your wives, as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her in order to make her holy. In other words, think about the way that Christians talk about what Christ did for the people of the world. Self-sacrifice. So husbands, do not use your power over a wife any more than Christ used power over the people. Christ submitted and sacrificed on behalf of the people. And the line right before, wives, submit to your husbands, is be subject to one another. There's a very equalizing phrase right before that. Be subject to one another. Then it says, wives, be subject to your husbands. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. So the equality of that is way stronger than Christians realize. But that's because a lot of male preachers in the Christian side of things never quote the before and after. They just quote the middle. Wives, be subject to your husbands. Your husband's the head of the house, so you have to submit. And I can't stand it when I hear Christian pastors use this text in such an obnoxious and untrue way.
So playing just kind of a textual interpreter for a second, isn't it, even though there is context to it and the before and after certainly gives it a bit of beneficial context, right? It still does say this problematic thing.
Yes.
So is it kind of, I ask you the same question I ask myself with these kinds of texts. Do you feel like it's theological gymnastics when you kind of have to find an interpretation that's more palatable? Or do you believe that that is actually what the text says?
So I look at it this way. What was the culture into which this text was written? The culture into which this text was written was women are property. They are owned and disposable. I can receive her and I can let her go. If I write on a certificate, she is dismissed, then she is dismissed and she is no longer my responsibility. I don't ever have to sacrifice for her. She has to keep me happy so that I allow her to live under my roof. This text was written into that kind of culture. And what it said to the men and the women, because those were the only marriages that we were talking about at that time, was, okay, wives, yes, honor the cultural norm here. Be subject to your husbands. And yes, in our patriarchal society, the husband is the head of the household. Fine. The new stuff that it adds is be subject to one another, and husbands, love your wife just like Christ loved the church. That's new stuff that the culture is not used to hearing back then. And it doesn't ask for the wives to change. It asks for the husbands to change a lot. So I don't see it as gymnastics to try to pick that text up and apply it today in even more equal expectations in gender-based relationships, because I see this text as demanding a move from radical inequality towards equality. And if I keep pushing on that trajectory, I feel like my interpretation is in sync with the trajectory of the text itself.
When you say that's new stuff, do you mean historically it was written later? Or it's new in that that's a newer morality that we ascribe ourselves to?
What I meant was, in that culture, they were very accustomed to hearing wives be subject.
I understand.
In that culture, it was shockingly weird for them to hear be subject to one another, or husbands, love your wives in the same way Christ loved/sacrificed for the church.
Got it. So you're just mapping that out to our time, and so it would go even farther.
Yes. There's another one that happens here too. This one's used all the time to justify why women shouldn't be preachers or teachers. It's 1 Timothy 2, dang it. And in this odd little letter, they describe how men should pray and should be able to do so, to hold out hands without anger or argument, and that women in these houses of prayer should dress themselves modestly in suitable clothing, not with their hair braided or with jewelry, gold or pearls or expensive clothes. If they want to dress up, they should dress themselves up in good works. And then it says this one, ouch. Let a woman learn in silence with full submission. I permit no woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She is to keep silent. Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam wasn't deceived.
Genesis 2 again.
Yep. Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became the transgressor. So in that odd little text, there's a bunch of problems, tons of problems. But in that time and culture, there were houses of prayer where women were not allowed at all. Only men. The women were not even invited to that house of prayer. But this letter to that culture where women were not allowed at all said, guys, make some room. The women are allowed now. Okay, they're not going to talk. They're going to sit in the back. They're not going to distract you with perfume and jewelry or anything like that. But they're present. they're in the room now, and they don't have to hear the discussions through their man. They get to hear them directly now. And then the problematic stuff at the end, right? So there was a progressive aspect to this scripture itself, even though it's used today super conservatively to maintain patriarchy.
And Judaism does something similar with regard to a woman's voice specifically, which is why this is where we get the Jewish law that women can't chant from the Torah or lead a service, because a woman's voice is so sexually arousing that it will distract the man from his valiant efforts. I'm being a little bit, for the metaphor, but it will distract men from their prayers. And so therefore, women are not allowed to be heard as a voice. And it's the same reason why in a traditional place of worship that women and men do not sit together. It's because, again, the woman will be so distracting. Now, you can make I think there is something to be said for maybe sitting somewhere you're not used to, or even not sitting with your spouse and kind of being alone with your thoughts. But that is egalitarian from that standpoint. This is not.
No.
This is women, you go over there. And I don't know, Joel, if you've ever been to older Jewish sanctuaries, kind of historic sanctuaries like in Venice and other places in Europe. And of course,
in Jerusalem
still exists. Yes. Yeah. So this still exists in America too, but many synagogues where the women sit, it wouldn't be like, okay, men, you have this half of the room, and women, you have this half. It's, okay, men, you're 5 feet away from the speaker right in front, and women, you're going to be upstairs in a balcony where the walls are so high that you may not even be able to see, and that sort of thing. And all because of this idea that it'll be too distracting.
Yes. Men are so weak. There's one other great story, New Testament, my last one for gender issues. There's a story where Jesus is somewhere, and a Syrophoenician woman comes. So she's Gentile. She's not Jew. But she comes and she begs him to help heal her daughter. And Jesus says something unexpected. He says, "Let the children be fed first. It's not fair to take children's food and throw it to the dogs." The assumption there being, in this story from Mark, that the children are God's children, the people of Israel, and Gentiles are the dogs. And she answers him, "Even the dogs get the crumbs." And he is corrected by her, and the daughter is healed. And there's something about his way of saying that he regretted. And she taught him something about even the way the culture was affecting his way of seeing the system, the gender system around him. And he learned it, and he didn't withhold power to heal her. He released it through her to her daughter. And I like that, that the only story where all the scribes and Pharisees and everybody that tried to catch Jesus and correct him, none of them did it. This Gentile woman did. And I love that story about gender in the New Testament.
Yeah, you have all these beautiful parables in the New Testament. The Torah and Bible is much more narrative. We get some of the parable kind of stuff in the Talmud, but not in the Bible. I always enjoy hearing those, and specifically your takes on them. Well, we solved gender problems. The two straight white men solved all gender problems.
There is a real issue there. I'm so glad you said that out loud. And I hope everybody has heard us from our own place of real privilege and enculturation. I hope you've heard both Eric and me do our best to recognize that we understand some of the difference between gender and sexuality, and we do not think binary male-female on these topics, or cis and homo on these topics. So I hope you hear us leaning into the wider and bigger reality that we feel God has revealed.
Absolutely, and beautifully said.
Thank you for joining us on the REALigionPodcast Podcast today, where a rabbi and a reverend walk into a podcast and talk real about religion. I'm Reverend Joel Tolbert, and on behalf of Rabbi Eric Linder and all the REALigionPodcast fans out there, we thank you for being with us today and invite you to send us any feedback or suggestions or topic ideas to REALigionPodcast@gmail.com. Until next time, keep it real.